And three, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls from all ages, thank you so much for joining me for this brand new interview. I have something special for you guys today. This man right here has a very inspirational story. You might have seen him on Cameo, which you could definitely buy a shout out from him. Definitely, link will be down in the description. But also, you may have seen him in the Ohio wrestling scene. He has definitely done a lot in the Ohio wrestling scene. You know, when he was trained by one Johnny Gargano, he was also trained by JT Lightning. He was also trained by Josh Prohibition over there in the Cleveland scene, and he was also tag teaming with someone by the name of Zach Gowen, definitely a huge sensation. He was also on the Fox News advocating to become a participant in the Royal Rumble a couple of years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, let me introduce you to the one and only Gregory Iron. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I am doing well. Thank you so much for doing this conversation.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to be doing it. I'm glad we could work things out.
Of course. Now, I always start these interviews with kind of like a spitball or fireball question because, of course, I always want to get the mood set. So my question to you, the first thing I want to ask, and this is very interesting to say the least, was talking about your time when you went on Fox News and you advocated. How was it like having that moment?
You know, it was surreal and sort of overwhelming, and to even getting to that moment that day was a lot. In typical, we might find this as we go out through the interview. There's something called Greg Iron luck that I usually have throughout my life, and it's been a constant for pretty much my whole life at this point. And so that Fox News interview, which I ended up talking about trying to get into the Royal Rumble back in 2012, big life moment, probably the biggest moment of my wrestling career up to that point, like getting a national television exposure on something like Fox News. Of course, I was scheduled for a show the night before somewhere in Pennsylvania for Chikara. The situation was organized by Chikara because I was going to be plugging the first ever Chikara pay-per-view, High Noon. The next day, I was going to be wrestling in the ECW arena for the pay-per-view after the Fox News interview. So naturally, driving to the show in Pennsylvania, one of the first road trips by myself, I had just paid off my car at the time, like a month earlier. So, of course, I'm about 3 hours into my 6-hour drive, and wouldn't you know it, my car engine explodes. Okay. So I'm stuck in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, and I borrow my buddy Benjamin Boone's AAA card because I'm an irresponsible 20-something-year-old kid and I do not have AAA. And I get my car towed to the nearest car place, and they confirm that my engine has exploded. And so I'm just devastated because I know I need to get to Fox News for this thing. And I'm calling everyone I know to try to give me a ride to New York City and spend the weekend with me, you know, which like is hard to do on the drop of a dime, right? And I end up calling Mike Quackenbush, who ran Chikara and had organized the whole thing. And I let him know the situation. And he goes, well, Greg, why don't you rent a car? And I go, well, I don't have car insurance. And over the phone he goes, Greg, what the F? And he was like so mad because like I was a poor wrestler at that time. Like obviously I was starting to make headway and gain more notoriety, but I was still struggling for money. I was just now getting the income that I had worked for 5 years. So long story short, he had 2 students drive backwards from the show in Pennsylvania 3 hours to pick me up, take me to the show that night, which I didn't show up in time for and couldn't wrestle on. Then the next day I hitched another ride to Fox News where Dave Lagana was secretly helping me not only do this Royal Rumble petition, but while working for TNA at the time, he was trying to help get me a job with WWE, which was kind of unprecedented. And, you know, they did my makeup for Fox News and everything. And as we were in the waiting room waiting to go on air, the host that I did the show with came in and said, you know, blah, blah, blah. We've had Vince and Linda on before, and they watch the show all the time. So when he leaves, Dave Lagana says to me, well, you know what you have to do now? And I said, what? And he goes, you've got to call out Vince McMahon right live on the air. And I was sitting there and I'm I'm thinking to myself, well, my car engine just exploded. Literally, I had to sell my car, which again I just paid off, for $75 to this piece of garbage guy at the car lot, because he said, well, I can't keep your car here. So he gave me $75. So now I have no car. And I'm sitting there, I go, you know what? I got nothing else to lose. And so I just go on air on Fox News. And I remember saying to the guy right before we went live, like, hey, what camera do I look into if I want to say something? He says, oh, just look at me the whole time. And I remember thinking, well, if I see the red light on whatever camera, that's the camera that's going to be on me. So I'm just going to look into that camera. And without telling him, I just looked in the camera. I said, blah, 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 Vince. I know you watch the show, and I know you've wrestled Zach Allen before. And, you know, if you're up for it, I'd love to take you on one-on-one myself. And I remember thinking, like, I can't believe I just did that. And I thought it was going to maybe – I didn't think I was actually going to get in the Royal Rumble. We can touch on that a little more if you want to, but I knew it was going to be good publicity, and just being able to sit there live on TV and call up Vince McMahon, crazy life moment. Never thought I'd be in a situation like that.
Well, that's awesome. I mean, of course, I actually remember watching that back in the day. I was just a little kid, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, this guy's calling out Vince McMahon for a match. Like, oh my gosh. But speaking about that, so during that year, 2012 was a huge year, especially in professional wrestling. I mean, obviously you had kind of the peak, I want to say, of when Impact Wrestling was kind of going a little bit downhill, because that's when kind of the views were going down. It was kind of more of the aces and eights kind of era was kind of slowing down a little bit. And then not only that, but the Royal Rumble 2012 was actually a pretty huge Royal Rumble match, to say the least, as well. So can you talk about kind of, you know, what was the mindset for you? Because you said you had nothing to lose, but was there any particular goal for you cutting that tremendous promo on Vince McMahon?
You know, there was no goal. Here's the thing: to this day, that petition to get in the Royal Rumble that I started, it gets talked about a lot, and usually in the sense that I'll get tweets occasionally from people, you know, just like haters or negative people who are just like, remember that time you tried to get in a Royal Rumble, it didn't happen? Well, guess what, guys? I never thought I was going to get in the Royal Rumble by doing a petition. Well, it was a thing where, again, to plug the Chikara Eye pay-per-view, Mike Quackenbush had this idea where he wanted something to get a little traction going into the pay-per-view. And unlike most of the characters in Chikara, I had a very real story that he felt like Chikara could capitalize on. And so he called me on the phone one day and said, I want you to cut a promo and say that you're going to be in the Royal Rumble and you're going to win it. And I remember thinking in that moment, that sounds insane. And like, and also stupid, because I like Mike a lot. And I think he has a great mind, but I remember thinking any Joe Schmo wrestler can cut a promo and say, I want to be in the Royal Rumble and I want to win. And I think it looked really Bush League. And I think it was actually a three-way conversation with Dave Lagana, because Dave's connection with Chikara was that he was doing he was helping produce the pay-per-view for Fight TV. I believe it was on Fight at the time. And Dave was involved in the conversations. And I remember I had to think quick in that phone call. And I said to myself, how could I do this in a way that made sense? And I remember pitching to Quack and Dave, like, what if I say that I won't be in the Royal Rumble, but my dream is WWE. And if you support me, there is a chance that I can get in the Royal Rumble. And if I can get in the Royal Rumble, I could live my ultimate dream and go to WrestleMania. And so I never thought that WWE was actually going to sign me by doing that. I just knew that it was going to get a lot of traction to plug Chikara, which was my first priority. If it got me to WWE, I wouldn't have been upset about it, but I wasn't banking on that. But I think it's kind of cool and crazy in retrospect to look at the idea that I had people pulling for me to get to the biggest organization, especially Dave, who, again, was working for TNA at the time. And I never thought I was going to go to WWE with it, but it was a cool moment.
Well, it was a huge moment, especially for your professional wrestling career. I do want to talk about your professional wrestling career, if we can, for a moment. Such an inspirational story. I mean, from your beginnings and just kind of going from, being trained by all these great wrestlers, and then having, a disability going through that is such an amazing thing. I mean, I relate when I talk about, going through a disability myself, and it's kind of great to hear other inspirational stories dealing with similar or almost the same issues. So, so can you talk about what was it like kind of pursuing your professional wrestling career?
I don't know if it was, I guess it was more difficult than most people that travel down that path. But, I have to always look at the situation where, I get asked the question a lot today, like, what's it like wrestling with one arm? And my answer is, I don't know. I've never wrestled with two. It's not like there was a time when I had two arms that fully functioned and I tried this. So I knew that the odds were sort of stacked against me from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And I think I went into wrestling with the mindset, and some parts of this mindset were good and some were negative for me in the beginning, but I always had to work harder for the things that I wanted, because I felt like, and this isn't necessarily other people that set this precedent for me. I set it for myself based on few experiences where I was bullied, few experiences where I was talked down to. Those things stuck with me. And so when it came to doing anything in my life, it was like, okay, I have to show up earlier. I have to work harder. I have to stay later. And I'm going to make sure that I tell everyone that I'm working harder and showing up earlier and staying later. And that ended up being my problem when I entered wrestling. But that was my mindset when I got into it, was I'm going to bust my ass. I'm going to study all I can, and I'm going to make sure that everyone knows. And real quick off the bat, when I was training with JT and Josh Prohibition, before Johnny Gargano took over the school, one day Josh Prohibition had to pull me aside because there was like a message board at the time where I would go online and I would talk crap to people. And just anyone who said anything negative about my trainers or my organization that I started with, Cleveland All Pro Wrestling, or myself, I would just run my mouth. And he pulled me aside and he said, listen, if you keep running your mouth like this, you're going to get blackballed. And I'm not going to want to associate with you at all. And you've got a bad attitude, and you need to shut up, stop saying the things you can do, and just do them. And it was a wake-up call, because I respected Josh so much. And I really think that if it wasn't for him pulling me aside that day, that chip on my shoulder, which is still there, it would be a lot bigger, and I wouldn't be wrestling. Sometimes you have to have a voice of reason that tells you and gives you that wake-up call, like, look, you don't have to say what you're going to do. Just shut up and do it. And that really changed my perspective on a lot of things. And I think if you change your perspective, the world can shift around you.
Oh, yeah. And it definitely gives a very influential vibe of kind of getting that, never give up, quote John Cena, mindset indeed. I do want to talk about one of your highlights of the beginnings of your career. And that happens to be November 20th of 2007, when you went one-on-one with one Johnny Gargano in what was called an upset. Can you talk about one of your first matches, one of your first big matches being that it was against one of your trainers?
Yeah, so it's funny that we always mention Johnny as my trainer, because while I do credit him as my trainer, a lot of the times after JT Lightning gave the school to Johnny, a lot of the times Johnny's a few months younger than me, so I don't know if he was in a position to be training, but he was definitely more advanced than I was. I mean, he's always been a prodigy of sorts, right? But I often cite that we were training each other, because we became fast friends. We grew up in the same neighborhoods, and we liked the same style of wrestling and everything. And so there were so many times when we would just be sitting in this basement at this building, Turner's Hall in Cleveland, and no one else from class would show up, and it would just be me and Johnny. So it was one of those things where it wasn't like Johnny was telling me like, oh, here's what you do today. It was like, what do you want to do? And I was like, what do you want to do? And we would just talk about things we've seen on TV or things that we wanted to try. And my match with Johnny in 2007 was really one of my first tests. The first name I ever wrestled in wrestling was March of 2007. That was Tracy Smothers, who was in ECW and WCW and WWF. And Tracy was really kind to me and gave me a lot of offense for a kid who had only been wrestling 6 months. But when I got in there with Johnny, it was a test of, can I keep up with this guy when the crowd is there in person? There had been so many times in training just sparring and everything, but to be in there with him in front of a live crowd, it's one of those things where you don't realize it until you're in there. it's kind of magical. And I will go back and I'll watch that match and I will pick it apart to death. Johnny will do the same thing. I think when you're decent at what you do, you're always criticizing your work, whether it's 14 years ago or a week ago. You're always looking at what you did wrong and you want to do it better. But for that time period in my career, I think that match was really good. And just for Johnny to let me win, I guess, and kind of give me that rub and give me a little bit of momentum. Because even for the time, again, Johnny had been wrestling almost 3 years, but he had been competing with some of the best wrestlers in the world at the time. You're talking Alex Shelley and Nigel McGuinness and, Chris Sabin and M-Dog 20 and Josh Prohibition and Zach Gallen. There's so many guys I'm probably forgetting for that time period. But for a kid that had been wrestling 2 or 3 years, he had a wealth of knowledge and in-ring experience with some of the best in the world. So getting that win over him really set in motion a storyline that we slow burned over almost a year, culminating in a last man standing match that, again, if we could redo it today, it would be much better. But for the time period, I think we told a great story. And I remember going into it, the thought was, okay, Greg needs to win this match because the first match I won, Johnny, in, I believe, February of 2008, because the win was eating away at his soul. He had this unblemished record. And the only blemish on his career in Pro Wrestling Ohio at the time was the handicap kid that beat him. And people kept reminding him of it. And so it got to the point where it boiled over. He attacked me. He gave me a concussion. He busted me open. He took me out of wrestling. So in this last man standing match, the goal was to take me out for good. So going into it, the booker wanted me to win. And I remember pitching the idea that I don't win, because even for as young as I was at that time, I'm really proud that I had this thought process. And I think this goes back to my love and my studying of professional wrestling. I realized early on that winning matters, but sometimes losing, if done properly, matters even more. And I looked at stuff like the classic example is Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Bret Hart from WrestleMania 13. I mean, he came up the bigger winner by bleeding out and passing out from the sharpshooter, right? And so I remember thinking, if we run the finish to that match in the exact same way that Johnny attacked me, with him busting me open and I get up, and him hitting me with his finisher at the time and I still get up, and then he has to do everything that he did a few months prior and then some to actually keep me down for the count of 10. And then when he leaves, if I stand up on my own 2 feet and don't get carried out on a stretcher like I did 6 months prior, then that is my victory. And to this day, I'm still very proud of that match, and I'm proud to say that Johnny is still my best friend in the world, and he's more than just a friend. He's like my brother. We argue like brothers, and we spend every holiday together, and I wouldn't trade my relationship with him for anything in the world.
Well, that's a beautiful story, especially with a match that is so awesome, because it displays not only the art of professional wrestling, but it also displays the storytelling. The losing side doesn't necessarily mean that they're the losing side. They're also winning in a sense as well. To me, it reminds me a lot of, like you mentioned before, Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Bret Hart at WrestleMania 13. Another one it reminds me of a lot is Tommy Dreamer during ECW, where he didn't necessarily win the big matches, or he didn't win the most extreme death match type, matches. But he won the crowd over. So that's what I think of when I think of all these great matches, is that, especially towards your career, there's so many moments that you're like, oh my God, that was like a 5-star. Meltzer, give it 5 stars, I swear. But then at the end of the day, the winner is also, a part of that. But you also mentioned that another winner of that match was also the loser.
For sure. And I think, again, the bigger part of wrestling is the storytelling. And I think in the end, like, winning, losing, you can still come up the winner if you win or lose, depending on how you tell that story. And that's the beauty of professional wrestling. And it's something that to this day, I try to get my dad to understand, because, he acts like he doesn't like wrestling, but he watches wrestling more than anyone in the household right now. And when I go over his house, I try to tell him what I'm doing, and he goes, "Did you win?" And I go, "Dad, it doesn't matter if I win. Like, what are you talking about?" He's like, "It matters to me." Like, but then he'll like, "Oh, you do that fake wrestling crap," and I'm just like, Oh my God, dude! Like it doesn't matter. I'll lose every match, like and I'll still look like $1,000,000. But that's a whole nother story entirely. My dad, what a piece of work, Jesus.
I mean, hey, there's bigger supporters, and then there's the biggest non-supporters who are, of course, your biggest supporters in disguise. So, of course, talking about your singles career, I do want to transition into your tag team career. Yes, you had the opportunity to tag team with a lot of great people, but one person in particular I want to talk about is one Zach Gowen, who had made an impact as a handicapped wrestler as well during the early 2000s in WWE and of course, in the independent wrestling scene. So can you talk about working with Zach Gowen and talk about your tag team work with him?
Yeah, working with Zach has been one of the most surreal and incredible experiences of my life. If it wasn't for Zach, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. Because when I saw him on WWE TV in 2003, that was the moment that pushed my love and my pursuit of wrestling over the edge. I just wanted to be a commentator or a broadcaster because I didn't think being a disabled wrestler was possible until I saw Zach. And that's when I started lifting weights, and I found a wrestling school in Cleveland. So to fast forward a few years and see how much he admired my work and my ethic, my work ethic, and to pitch the idea of us being a tag team and traveling together, it was pretty cool. And knowing that he had overcome drug and alcohol addiction while seeing my story, it's interesting how our stories had intertwined because he inspired me to be a wrestler without knowing it. And then I inspired him to keep going with wrestling without knowing it once he got out of rehab. And so for us to realize that the sum of the parts are greater than the individual parts and kind of team up instead of competing with one another, like, well, I'm going to be the handicapped wrestler, like we just kind of decided we were going to do it together. And man, it's overwhelming to just think that back in 2003, I was just a kid who was dreaming, and I would have killed to meet Zach Gowen. And now, I'm spending times in these cars with him and learning from him, and not just him being my tag team partner, but my genuinely closest friends. And the way he's helped me, not just as a wrestler, but as a human, doing motivational speaking gigs with kids in schools and everything, just finding another outlet to share my story with the help of Zach and with Zach on many occasions. It's been a cool experience. And I think the coolest experience that I've had with Zach is being able to wrestle him in 2012 in front of over 1,000 people in Cleveland, in the very same building that I wrestled Zach, or that I wrestled Johnny just a few years prior in that last man standing match. I wrestled Zach in that building. And at the time I had gotten in the greatest shape of my life because I just wanted to be good. And I remember going into the match, Zach and I both didn't want to wrestle each other because for some reason, all of a sudden these insecurities came out, and we thought it was going to be kind of like the South Park bit where, crippled fight, and we didn't want people to laugh at us. And then I remember going into the match, we realized when we have matches with other people, the story is to make them forget for a few minutes that we are the disabled wrestler. And so we both realized the story isn't two disabled wrestlers fighting. We just have to make these people forget for 15 or 20 minutes that we're the disabled wrestlers. And I look back at that match and I feel like I moved different that day, like better than I'd ever moved before. And just to be able to keep up with them and tell the story of like, hey, this guy has one leg and I have one arm, and we're going to make you forget about that. That's an incredible life moment. And I'm glad that we got to share that story together. And I just can't thank Zach enough for all that he's done for me personally and professionally.
Well, that's once again, it was an amazing story, especially with you and Zach Gowen, two, very different competitors, but sharing a similar story and kind of inspiring each other without even knowing it. One thing I did want to mention as well is, what was I going to say? Oh yeah. So one thing I did want to mention as well is that, with you talk about the city of Cleveland and, kind of all the professional wrestlers that have came out of there and, training under there with all these great people like Johnny Gargano, like JT Lightning, like, just so many people that we can name, for the entire interview. So can you talk about how special Cleveland is to you, and, being your hometown?
Man, I love Cleveland, and I might be a little biased because this is where I was born and raised, but there is a rumor going around Cleveland rocks, and I like to say that is a true story. And, it's funny that you mentioned so many great wrestlers that come from Cleveland now, because when I was a kid, the only guy that even represented Ohio that I knew of was Al Snow. And so if you mention anybody in WWE from Ohio, you would have to go, yeah, well, Al Snow's our guy, right? And now you look at the list of names, and it's, there's like, I guess you can include me on a smaller scale, but there's Gargano and Matt Cross and Dolph Ziggler and EC3 and The Miz and a ton of guys that I'm forgetting right now, but like the caliber of talent that has come out of Northeast Ohio in the last decade and a half is pretty incredible. And I think it just goes to show that, if you extend beyond Cleveland, I think there's a bunch of people in Ohio and the Midwest in general that I think we're finally getting more of our due, and people are seeing how hard we work and we bust our ass, and we want to prove that, like, we are in the top tier of wrestling talent. And, especially because a lot of us out of Cleveland, we weren't exactly trained by a notable WWE alumni. Some areas have like this guy who was in WWE for a certain period of time, but there is that sector of us that was trained by JT Lightning, who never really did anything of relevance. He was just a guy who, I don't even think he was formally trained, to be honest. I think he trained himself and started a wrestling promotion in the early 90s. And you'll find that that's the case with a lot of guys. And just the fact that we were able to take the basics and then combine that with work ethic and the realization that you need to get out and travel. You can't just wrestle in Cleveland. When you combine all that, I think it just goes to show that Cleveland has proven that our wrestlers are pretty superior athletes, and that we can be in the top level. And it's not just Al Snow. There's a bigger sector of Cleveland and Ohio that is really showing its dominance in the top promotions in the world, and it's a pretty cool thing.
Well, yeah, of course, whenever you think about Cleveland, you always have to think about the wrestlers that they have produced over the past decades and generations before. There's always a great legacy that always comes when it comes to Cleveland producing these awesome wrestlers.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm just so proud to be from Cleveland, and I think my journey as a wrestler and a human might take me to some other states. I might move somewhere else one day for a little bit, but Cleveland will always be home, and I want to be as close to home as possible. Like even, Johnny right now, he lives down in Florida, obviously, so he can be close to NXT and everything, but he makes sure he goes out of his way to be home as much as possible because he loves and appreciates Cleveland. And it's given us some pretty terrible memories personally, but also professionally and personally, it's bred some of the greatest memories of our lives. And as speaking for myself, I was a kid that just came out of the ghetto west side of Cleveland, Ohio, and I had a very tough upbringing, but that upbringing made me who I am. And so Cleveland will always have a special place in my heart because it made me who I am as a human being, and I'll forever be grateful for that.
Well, of course. And of course, Gregory Iron is doing the greatest right now in his professional wrestling career. So once again, I'm talking about Cleveland. You did wrestle for a school called Chikara. So can you talk about what Chikara meant to you and how that kind of breaded you into the professional wrestler that you are today?
Chikara was one of the first major independent wrestling opportunities that I got. And it actually happened because in 2008, again, when I was still really developing as a performer, Sammy Callahan, who's another Ohio boy, gave me the opportunity to wrestle in a scramble match with Mike Quackenbush. And through that match, I got contacts with Mike for Chikara. And he just said, please just always email me and remind me of you. And when there's a spot available, I'll give you a chance. And so every 5 or 6 months, I would bug him with an email, and there was nothing. And finally, in 2010, the Young Lions Cup was coming around, and he sent me a message and said, "Hey, someone was injured in the Young Lions Cup, so I have an opening. Would you like to be a part of it? Are you available? And I said yes, knowing that I had another crappy booking that weekend that he was pitching. But I immediately canceled those bookings because I knew Chikara would help me grow as a performer. And I ended up having a match with Lince Dorado, who, of course, now is in WWE. And I'd like to think that being put with Lince was the best thing that could have happened to me, because he brought out the best in me. There's some guys that I look back on throughout my career that I say, that guy not only made me look good, he made me better than I was at that time, and I learned from it. And I think of guys like Johnny or Matt Cross or Silas Young, and I think of Lince, because Lince was able to take my limited moveset and bring out stuff in me that I didn't know existed. And it's because of that match. It was supposed to be a one-time deal, but it was because of that match that I got booked for Chikara the next night, and I continued to get booked for Chikara for 2 years. And I look back and I don't know if I was ready for that spot on the roster. I know I wasn't up to the level I am now, but I appreciate it. It was a learning experience, and I will forever be grateful for Chikara for giving me that chance.
Well, that's awesome. Well, once again, Gregory, thank you so much. I mean, your story has been so inspirational. Just for the short time that I've been, doing some detail and doing my research, it's absolutely phenomenal to see an inspirational story like yourself, going from, the rough beginnings all the way to finding your love for professional wrestling, and then having these professional wrestling classics, and going and doing all these, and even being a part of TNA Gut Check at one point. And it's just absolutely amazing to see how you went from your beginnings all the way till now.
Yeah, it's been a weird journey, but I often tell kids when I talk to them in schools with motivational speaking stuff that for me, the scariest part of this whole journey had been failure. And to this day, I'm overwhelmed by the fear of failure. But you have to take that risk. You have to take that chance to potentially fall flat on your face, and then be willing to pick yourself back up and dust yourself off and do it again. Because I remember I'd often get this feeling when I would go to wrestling shows right before I started wrestling school, because I was unsure of training. I didn't want to suck at it. Like, I thought to myself, what if I enter wrestling school and I suck? Will it change my whole perspective on professional wrestling? Will I not love it as much? But I would get this feeling going to wrestling shows where, I'd go to a WWE show, and in the beginning of it, I'd be having fun, but then I'd be in my own head, and I'd think to myself, I should be in that ring. Like, I want to feel what it's like to be in that ring. And had I not tried to be a wrestler, not only do I not live these life moments that 16-year-old Greg would have never imagined, but I would be sitting here as a 33-year-old man, not having this conversation with you, but wondering what it would have been like if at 18 or 19, I just would have tried. And I think the feeling of regret is much more powerful than failure. So I would encourage anybody who has a dream of any sort, not just wrestling, but anything you want to do in your life. Don't listen to the lies that people tell you. People are going to tell you you can't do it, and those people are going to tell you that based on their own experiences or their own insecurities. I would encourage you to go out there, try, and suck. Because if you suck, at least like, either A, this isn't for me, or you can think to yourself, B, how can I fix this and make it better? Because you have to put in the time and put in the work. And I would much rather have failed at wrestling than not tried at all. So try to suck. And if you don't suck, eventually it'll get better. Suck and suck again. And with repetition, inevitably, I think you'll learn something and you'll come out better in the end.
Well, that's an awesome motivation. Thank you so much, Greg. For those who don't know, make sure you follow Gregory Iron on all social medias. Link will be down in the description below. And of course, you could also get a shout out from the one and only Gregory Iron on Cameo. Make sure you guys get that as well. Link will be down in the description. Once again, Gregory, thank you so much. And I will see you guys again in the next interview. Boom.